I'd like to welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us on this a day to consider one of, what is arguably perhaps the biggest challenge we currently face, certainly in the short term, and if we do it wrongly in the long term, which is the problem of unemployment and how we fix it, how we deal with it, how we fix it. And we're very pleased to have a couple of experts joining us on this call, more of which later. I'm going to just very quickly, what the program for the morning will be is first up, after I make the general introductions, we'll have Dr. Michael Fletcher speaking on the topic of social insurance, which is one of those areas that has really become, has got itself on the radar quite quickly in quite a few places. So Michael will speak for about 15 minutes or so, and then there'll be plenty of opportunity to discuss. And we're happy with either questions or comments, but please keep comments to about 2 minutes or less. Then Bill Cochrane will give us a rundown on another proposal that's out there in the ether, which is the job guarantee as another way of dealing with unemployment. Again, there'll be an opportunity for discussion. And then we're going to close up with a which way forward. In other words, what is, we know our various options, including the status quo. How are we going to move our way forward through this coming, tsunami of unemployment? I thought it was actually not a bad idea to start with a 125-year perspective on unemployment in New Zealand. Now, it's probably fair to say that these numbers can't be taken too literally. They are sourced from, various statistics department numbers over the years. But the measure of what is unemployment, of course, changes over time. But if we look at those peaks, the most obvious one, the one where I'm kind of scrolling at the moment, the Depression, the Great Depression. Now, that's showing about 8 or 9% unemployment, although, we routinely hear it's nearer 20 or 30%. And a lot of that is that definitional thing, I guess, particularly maybe in a world where there was a lot more rural employment, perhaps. But whatever, that was a massive peak. Funnily enough, the most recent one was, self-inflicted, which was the 80s and 90s peak of unemployment following the Rogernomic and Ruthanasia period. And on the right here, in 2020 or so, is the Treasury's predictions, which I've noticed have been uniformly panned as being rather optimistic for the tsunami of unemployment that's heading our way very shortly. But one of the things I think, while it's interesting to look at the peaks, I think it's also interesting to look at the troughs, because what we also find is that not only are there periods of great unemployment, but there's differences in what happens after those periods of unemployment, and most notably that 30-odd years post-war, where unemployment really was around about 1%. The 30 or so years since, since the 1980s, 90s peak, we've been in a position where the idea is that unemployment, there's a natural rate of unemployment which is more like 4 or 5 times that. So that in itself, I guess, should pose a question that we should give pause to and consider today. So before we're about to head off on our journey of the next couple of hours, I'll just make some introductions. First of all, myself, Martin Taylor. I convene a group looking at new ideas in and thinking in economics, and especially their impact on the environment and social inequality, which we've found as an increasing problem, and particularly looking at some of the ideas coming out of the Green New Deal. Very happy to be working with the Fabians, who have really led the way in a lot of thinking and new ideas and discussion and debate over the years that allow us to get together and talk through these ideas. I'm going to be joined on this by my fellow speakers, Dr. Michael Fletcher, Senior Research Fellow for the Institute of Governance and Policy Studies at Victoria University. You'll be able to see that. Michael has a PhD in economics from AUT and a background as an academic and policy advisor, working mainly in labour markets and social welfare research and policy. And in fact, with all those skills, he was a special advisor to the Welfare Expert Advisory Group, which delivered its report last year. And again, we're very pleased to be joined later on in the second segment by Dr. Bill Cochrane. So Bill is senior lecturer with the School of Social Sciences at Waikato University. And again, his expertise is in labour studies, and that's where he has a considerable academic interest and research interest. Currently focused on local labour markets and low-wage skill employment. So, Michael, what I'll do is I'll get you to, I'm going to stop this screen sharing now, and when you're ready, I'll get you to, you can just fire up your slides and get started. And as I mentioned, everybody, we will be, Michael will give us about a sort of a 15-minute or so overview of the social insurance option that's gaining a lot of interest for dealing with unemployment. And then following that, save up your questions, because we'll have plenty of time after to discuss this particular issue with Michael and the group. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Martin. Can I just check what you can see on your screens? I'm a little unsure.
I can see your opening slide.
The single opening slide?
Yep, the title slide.
Wonderful. Kia ora koutou. So thank you, Martin, and thank you everyone for coming. I'm just going to talk a bit about social insurance schemes and how they may or may not fit as a response to the unemployment in New Zealand post-COVID. By way of summary of what I'm going to say, I want to start by saying that there are both advantages and disadvantages with social insurance and unemployment insurance schemes. So I'm not trying to either praise them or diss them entirely. There are good sides and bad sides to both. However, my view is that now is not the time for us to be focusing on social insurance as the right way forward for now. And I say that for two reasons. One, first of all, the absolute top priority, and I'll keep repeating this over and over, no doubt, is to re-establish the basic adequate minimum income support through the core welfare system. And it does concern me that social insurance proposals risk detracting from that objective. Even if we were to go down, excuse me, down the social insurance scheme, I think it's really important to understand that they are complex and detailed things, and that with social insurance, the detail is everything. You can have designs that produce very different distributional and other labour market outcomes depending on how you set them up. It'd be no quick and easy matter to set up a good social insurance or two-tier system, and it would take a long time. It's not, to my mind, something that is going to be, could be a quick solution to our current crisis. So just a little bit by way of background or context, it's very common in the OECD and the literature to distinguish between social insurance and social assistance-based welfare systems, what's sometimes called the Beveridge versus Bismarck way of thinking. Bismarck introduced social insurance in Germany. Beveridge, in his report in the UK in 1943, cheated slightly because he got the name, but we were there first. And in fact, the publicity material that came with Beveridge's report in the UK is fascinating. It's got a comparison of the pre-existing British system, what he's proposing, and then alongside it, and all the graphics and material that they put out, was New Zealand, and how what he was proposing would compare with New Zealand. The core features of what we have, and this is not new to everyone, but just to quickly go over it, is our system is based on first of all, on poverty protection based on need, not income replacement. Crucially, it's funded out of general taxation, and it's income tested, which I'll come back to later is a bit of an issue. Two other critical points about our system historically and to some extent still. It was supplemented by a number of cash and in-kind universal assistance measures or benefits, free schools, free hospitals, New Zealand superannuation, the family benefit, all of those things that were universal. And absolutely crucially, historically, it was underpinned by a commitment to full employment, which we saw disappear in the late 1980s. And that was what was called by Frank Castle's the wage earners welfare state. We've allowed that to wither over time. It's not, to my mind, a bad fundamental system at all, but we've allowed it to wither over the last 30 years or so. And similarly, we've not stuck by the full employment commitment. Okay, so what about social insurance? Couple of slides on what they are and what they look like. As I said, the most common system in OECD countries is to have a two-tier higher social insurance or unemployment insurance scheme with a base social assistance or minimum income protection scheme underneath that. Basically, all except the really nastiest, harshest few OECD countries all have a social assistance minimum protection floor underneath them. It's basically, it's the bedrock of poverty protection and of minimum social justice. Social insurance, on the other hand, is primarily about risk sharing. It's about protection from risk. And it's worth noting as an aside that social insurance can handle situations that private insurance can't. It can deal with uncertainty and asymmetric information and unequal information, imperfect information and so on. So it's got a lot of advantages that simply the market can't manage. Entitlement can be linked to individual contributions, and you can think of it like KiwiSaver. How much you put in is going to determine, along with investment patterns, how much you get out, or it can be a defined benefit, or there are variants on that. The actual design characteristics of social insurance schemes vary hugely, and there's none of these points on this slide apply to every single scheme. Most commonly, though, they do pay a percentage of your prior earnings up to some cap. Often that'll have step down, so you start on, say, 70%, and it drops to 60 and then drops to 50 as time goes by. The top rates vary hugely across the OECD, from around 40%, I think, in Turkey to 90%. It's common too to have some sort of minimum prior employment requirement. Not in every case though, and that might be you've got to work for 3 out of the last 6 months, or 24 out of the last 36, or whatever it might be. They're often compulsory, but again, they're not always. So for example, in Denmark, they are voluntary, but they still have some form of state backing or support that lies behind them. Payment is, again, not always, but nearly always time limited. And after you run out, you exhaust your entitlement, you drop back onto that basic social assistance floor. You can think of the COVID income relief payment that the government announced recently as having some of the characteristics of an unemployment insurance scheme. It's fixed term, it's short 8-week period that you can get it for. You have to have worked for 15 weeks prior to getting it in order to be entitled, so it's got a prior employment requirement. It's controversially higher than the social assistance benefit floor, but in this case it pays a flat rate rather than a percentage of previous earnings. What about advantages of social insurance schemes? One of the critical ones is consumption smoothing. So well above the poverty measure, middle income earners and so on, if they face a sudden drop in short-term income or a sudden shock to their income, it minimizes that disruption. And you get that, that's one of the things that people point to about the Danish flexicurity system, which we might want to talk about later, is less concern about being laid off if in fact you're getting a very high social insurance payment to cover that drop. And it's related to that, the entitlement is individualized. It's not based on need, it's based on what you've lost. And so that cushions two-income families from the drop in income from one job loss. One of the efficiency things that is important about social insurance is because it's paying a higher rate, it allows for longer job search or better job matching, or it might be transition to retraining, or whatever it might be. Depending on how they're designed, they can offer wide coverage for workers and self-employed. Not always, so precarious workers or workers who haven't met the pre-employment requirement may miss out, but that's a design characteristic. Another advantage that people often point to is that it can shift some of the funding costs away from general taxation and excuse me, and onto payroll levies. So if there's a concern, excuse me, of budget pressures and budget cuts and so on, that may be more protected if it's through a payroll levy. Although I would point out that we've seen political pokes at ACC levies, so they're not absolutely immune from it. Another one of the advantages, I'd count it as advantages, possibly some wouldn't, is that in some schemes it's linked to, particularly in Scandinavian Nordic countries, to union membership and to collective agreement coverage. What about disadvantages? As I've already referred, it does not address the welfare adequacy for those who are not covered by the schemes. So you still absolutely need an adequate welfare floor. They're very unlikely to be as redistributional. After all, their objective is to replace income rather than redistribute it. It's highly unlikely that a scheme in New Zealand would do as much for poverty protection or poverty reduction as, say, upgrading our current status quo. In the New Zealand context, integration with ACC, I think, would be complex. You can think of it as, well, ACC is a good place to start, and we could build on that, and I'll come back to that at the end. But it's not straightforward. So if we were to think about, say, an unemployment insurance for job risk only, there's a risk of yet another tier. So you might have welfare, ACC, and this unemployment insurance scheme. And that leaves open the question of what about sickness and disability? If you were to go for the comprehensive coverage of everything, all risks, income loss risks, that's potentially a good way to go long term, but it's complicated and high cost. One of the other things that I think is a concern about social insurance, and although I have seen some argue the opposite way around, and I'll show you a graph about that in a second, is I think they're potentially divisive in terms of public support for welfare. There's a risk that they'll actually worsen the us and them divide rather than lessening it, because some people who've got covered by the social insurance are less concerned about the social assistance floor. I think that's different from ACC, importantly, because ACC is supported because it's a single system. It's the same for all of us. There is a bit of evidence that high social insurance and generous minimum income protection go together, but it's weak, and the direction or the causality itself is doubtful. And I just wanted to show a graph or two about this. So this is casual stuff, so I wouldn't take it too seriously, but these are all the OECD countries. On the horizontal axis there is what you would get if you had been earning the average wage and you're getting your full social insurance entitlement if you're in a country that has it, and it's as a percentage of the average wage. So you can see Greece is down the bottom and running right across to Luxembourg, or so you're close to 90%. On the vertical axis is what you get, what a person would get on way of minimum income protection. This includes the housing, cash housing assistance, and that's expressed as a percentage of household median disposable income. So different denominator, but still both measures of generosity. if there was a close relationship between the two, you would expect to see a diagonal line from the bottom left up to the top right. You'd expect to see, you know, stingy down the bottom left, stingy on both, generous on both, up on the top right. Basically, what we see is they're scattered all over the show, from, you know, in with no strong pattern in any way at all. That's for a single person. It changes a bit for a sole parent with 2 kids, depending on different countries' attitudes towards supporting children and sole parents, but it's basically still scattered all over the show. So there's no obvious close relationship between the generosity of one and the generosity of the other. In our current context, I think there is a very high risk that focusing on social or unemployment insurance would undermine efforts to fix up the existing welfare system. I don't think it's likely at all that going first for the former would lead us rapidly towards the latter, if at all. Plus, the other point that I think is important in the current context to note is that unless we do get, Bill, a good jobs guarantee scheme, we're likely to end up with rising long-term unemployment stretching out over some years. This is not going to be gone quickly. It took years, several years, for the GFC unemployment to unwind, even down to the 4% that it got to, and a lot longer than that in the 90s. So social insurance or unemployment insurance is unlikely to cover long periods out of work, so we're still going to need those people covered well by a minimum welfare system. As far as the jobs guarantee scheme goes, and I'm sure Bill and there'll be others will have more to say about that later. You can have both. There's no reason at all why you couldn't have a short, say for example, a short 3 or even 6 month unemployment insurance and follow that with a job guarantee. Excuse me. But you're still going to need that minimum floor for everyone else. And to my mind, it begs the question of why not simply just have an adequate minimum plus a jobs guarantee. So just to finish, what about ways forward? And this is jumping ahead to a later conversation, no doubt. To my mind, our existing system is not all that bad in form. It basically needs repair first and foremost. We've had 30 years of decline. We need to restore the commitment to full employment, and it does need to adapt to the way families now have 2 incomes and to the growth of sole parenting. But those things are doable under the current structure. Another point that I think is really important is we need to make sure that the system is not only capable of coping with economy-wide crises such as we're dealing with at the moment, but crucially it has to work with everyday, ordinary, individual shocks, which is what most people face most of the time. So what about possible ways forward? I think it's possible to achieve most of the benefits of social insurance plus poverty protection at the same time through 3 or 4 key changes. One is to have significantly increase the core rates. You'll all know that the Welfare Expert Advisory Group was very clear about that. And alongside that would go a less need for the targeted set of add-ons that we have been using, the accommodation supplement, hardship grants, and all the rest of it. You could, for example, so the government, I think, to their credit, linked welfare rates to their average weekly earnings. The current the current adult single person rate is about 25% of average weekly earnings. You could tie it to say 40% of average weekly earnings. And I'd say that if you were going to have an unemployment insurance set at, say, the much higher, say, the ACC rate of around 80, then definitely the minimum should be set at something close to 40% of average weekly earnings. We're in desperate need of revamping the employment services, which we allowed to become totally atrophied, and were increasingly used just as a testing measure for entitlement or for welfare rather than as a proper employment service. And that includes provision of active labour market programs and or a job guarantee. I rather like the idea of restoring the old separate employment service and breaking it apart from the provision of the income side of work and incomes work. And because of that way that families have changed their work and living patterns, we do need to move towards individualising entitlement, which we can do under the existing system. I've elsewhere recommended that we at least do that as far as disregarding partners' income up to the average weekly earnings, but there's no reason why it couldn't be higher than that. If you do those things, and after you do those things, we could look at extending social insurance by extending ACC. To my mind, though, the first place to go with that is to deal with that long-standing problem of the disparity between the way the same sort of situation is dealt with if it's due to an accident rather than due to sickness or disability. So extend it to sickness and disability first. But I would say do that not until after fixing up the existing welfare system. So thank you. That's all I have to say, and happy to answer questions or take comments.
Thank you very much, Michael. That's I think that was an excellent overview, summary of the key, well, actually both what the scheme could be, some of its advantages and disadvantages, and some of the design issues that have to be considered if a social insurance type scheme is introduced. Now, we'll open the floor to both questions and comments. If you have a question or comment, would you mind using that raise your hand, the little blue or the little hand icon or word at the bottom of your participants panel? And let us know, as I say, if it's a comment, please keep it to under a couple of minutes. I see Harpreet, you've got your hand up.
That's right. Yes, hi Martin. Sorry, I just realized that I was on mute all this time, so I could not even, I was saying good morning, but maybe you guys were not hearing me. Anyway, my question is that the content of this webinar today, would this be available on the News Amphibian website, Society website, or where can we go back if you want to read it again?
Yes, it will. So two things. First of all, we will put up a video of today's session. Okay. So that'll be on the Fabian's website, available, open to the public. Right. And the second is that if Michael or Bill are okay, we can send links to their presentations and indeed possibly some notes. So subject to them being okay with that, we'll send links to those, and we can even put them in the chat today. And by the way, you're welcome to save the chat. On the bottom right of that the chat screen, you'll see you can save the chat before you go if there's anything interesting in there, such as links or comments that people have made. Thanks, Harpreet. If you can put your hand down as well once you've asked your question. Steve, your hand's up.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. I just wanted to slip in a political question and ask Michael if he could just make a comment on why he thinks the current government is sluggish in implementing the recommendations of the WEAG report. Thank you.
I know no more than you, really. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I would say with the Welfare Expert Advisory Group, when that report was presented, the price tag looked was large. Well, it was a number that looked large back in those days. It looks like tiny cosmos compared to what we talk about these days. But there were parts that could have been done step by step, and so that could have happened in a progressive way. And I know the Minister has talked repeatedly about 3 to 5 years as a work program or so on. Well, there are things that could honestly have been done more readily, more quickly than 3 to 5 years, for sure.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bill, your hand's up.
Yeah, hi, thanks very much. And thanks, Michael, for that comparison.
Bill?
Yeah. I guess 2 points at this point. One, the question that was just asked, I think, is important, and there is that question of whether the government has any determination to do the WEAG, carry out the WEAG recommendations. And the question is how long we should wait to see. Is your 40% of average weekly income, weekly earnings, is that what the WEAG recommended, or was that an increase on that?
No, sorry, I had the piece of paper and I can't find it now. No, I can't find where I had. No, it wasn't drawn on the Welfare Expert Advisory Group things. And I do think it's important that we don't think of the Welfare Expert Advisory Group recommendations as the one and only package that could be done. And sorry, I can't. I did look at how much it would equate to, but it would be a substantial increase.
Yeah, my impression is it wouldn't. I don't know. 40% probably is a bit higher than it would have been, but I might be wrong there.
Then what would have been? Sorry.
Sorry.
Then what would have been?
The Welfare Expert Advisory Group recommendation would have been less than 40%, would it?
Yes, I think it's right.
So that's a further increase on what the group recommended. I guess my biggest concern is that even if you individualize welfare entitlements, which you cover in quite rightly, at 40%, there's still going to be significant numbers of households on quite moderate incomes, like around the median of an average wage, with 2 earners, who will see very significant falls in income if they become unemployed. And the reality that many households face is that they're living very close to their incomes mainly because of housing costs, mortgages or high rents, and therefore a significant fall in income of that sort is a real problem, and could even lead to defaulting on mortgages, or certainly having to move house, which has got all sorts of disruptive implications for kids and all that kind of thing. So, I mean, that's my that's a significant concern I have about essentially a single rate welfare system. I mean, in saying that, I thoroughly agree with you that we need to, it's absolutely imperative that we improve the welfare system to ensure that it prevents poverty and does provide people with a dignified living, as was set out by the Welfare Advisory Group. But whether that is the end of the matter is the question.
Thanks, Bill. That's much appreciated. Excellent, actually excellent points for us to have examine. We'll have time for 2 or 3 more. Jane, you've had your hand up for a wee while. Would you like to?
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to ask Michael what his feeling is towards universal basic income, please.
I am not a supporter or fan of universal basic income. In order to make it high enough to meet all circumstances, sole parent with several children and so on, it needs to be very high and therefore gets very expensive, and also provides a lot more money than other people would need. So I'm not a supporter of it, and I personally don't have a concern with a system which allows humanely and appropriately applied activity testing.
Okay, so my follow-up question then would be, surely modern monetary theory shows us that actually we can afford universal basic income, and where it may seem really unfair that people on a high income still receive it, because it's after all universal, we can tax them at a higher rate. Indeed, I think the high tax rate does need to go up, to claw back some of that so that inequality in our society is lessened rather than increasing, which seems to be the trend.
I agree that you could do a fair bit to improve it by increasing the progressivity of the income tax scale, absolutely, and wealth taxes for that matter.
Thanks, Jane. That was very good. Rajiv, again, you've been waiting a wee while. I'll let you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. Thank you, Michael. I haven't fully understood the concept of. I think your suggestion was to bring in social insurance as a short-term measure, possibly. But I thought conceptually insurance is about managing risks, and you need to finance the risk-taking ability over a period of time by paying the premiums. So how would that come in as a fix? What we really need now is to fix a short-term solution to the crisis that we have.
Sorry, I didn't get the question. How would what?
Sorry, what I meant is this. I mean, insurance is generally a risk management exercise, yes. Right? So we basically pay the premium over a period of time, which gives the financial cushion to manage the risks, yes, when the adversity arises. And I think you mentioned earlier that social insurance could be seen as a short-term solution to the current problem before we move to other modalities. So how would that work as a short-term solution?
No, I don't think it is a short-term solution. All I was saying that if you wanted, in conjunction with the jobs guarantee, for example, you could have something a bit like the current COVID income relief payment, as a very short-term cover. But that's not. That's only a very short-term adjustment period. At the moment, it's 8 weeks. It's not. I wouldn't describe that as full social insurance.
Thanks. I'll just thank you very much, Raji. Much appreciated. I'll move on. There's two. We'll take two more, Barry and Jeff, and then we'll get on to our next session with Bill. Barry, your question, please, or comment.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Sorry, there's no video on. I apologize for that. Next time I'll have it sorted. Maybe have my hair done. Hey, look, just want to say fantastic. I think this is well overdue. I've worked in the insurance space for 15 years, and the number of families that I see struggle with these kind of short-term disruptions and displacements is massive. One of the things I would say is there was the mention around that the social insurance is really being put forward as a unemployment catch-all, but and that to have it cover for sickness and disability, although ACC does cover for disability quite nicely, even if it is a short-term period with ACC, that sickness piece, you end up having members of our society who fall ill. And when someone has an illness in a household, not only does it impact the individual, it ultimately impacts the partner. So you can have one illness impact 2 income streams. So I would say the most vulnerable people that also require, that should come before the unemployment aspect, is the most vulnerable of those who have short-term illness that get displaced from work because they don't have the capacity to look for new roles, to retrain for a period of time. Then look at the unemployment side, because that is as painful in some regards, because I'm coming from a family where my father was displaced for 5 years in that 90s period. I know the repercussions of that. But you still have the capacity to go out and retrain and find work, although it might be a delay in finding that. So I would say to look after our more vulnerable first would be critical. That's just coming from all my experience in that private insurance space and disability and health. And the only other thing that I would question would be the sustainability of the premium cost if we are using global reinsurers, or I'm not sure, I might have missed that part of it, but whoever's charging us the premium for covering this insurance, we need to make sure that it's sustainable, because quite often I see families get priced out of these insurance policies as the premiums skyrockets up, and I'd hate to see that for a nation. That's sort of all I've kind of got to say. But I love it. I think we need it. We needed it for years, and it's brilliant.
Thanks, Barry. Michael, did you have anything to add, or I'll move to the next question?
I need to reinforce the point about the impact of illness of one person on their partner.
Yeah, those points were really well made. Thank you, Barry. Jeff, we'll take yours as the last question in this session, this part of this segment.
Yeah, I think I can be heard now. Michael, right in the early part of what you were talking about, you compared social insurance with private insurance arrangements to tide people over. And I'm very conscious that in the current situation where where some households actually have reserves in hand and others have no reserves in hand, you get an accelerated worsening of the distributional consequences of unemployment. And just wondering if you could reflect a little on some of the mechanisms that people have been resorting to in actually existing reality, if you like. The one that I'm conscious of is people doing hardship withdrawals from their KiwiSaver, so that it becomes sort of a substitute for what a social insurance program might otherwise have provided, except that drawing on your KiwiSaver as a hardship withdrawal has much more severe downstream consequences than a social insurance would have. But it is the fact of the matter is that people with their backs to the wall resort to all sorts of devices to get by, and there may be something to be learned from observing how in the last month and in the coming 2 or 3 months actual New Zealand workers manage to keep feeding the family.
Yes, I think that's a really good point about people resorting to the provision to withdraw KiwiSaver in the face of hardship, which is just transferring the cost somewhere into the future. Yeah. But I guess my basic point is there are a whole lot of people who are already doing it really hard, and a whole lot of people who are continuing to do it hard who don't have those reserves and won't have much to draw on. And I would hate to see us get further distracted from addressing those issues that were pre-existing anyway.
I guess essentially that's me supporting your point that social insurance is a diversion from the real issue.
Right. Yes.
The people who do have reserves to get by are the ones who would benefit primarily from social insurance. The ones who don't probably won't.
Yes. Yes. Oh, I see. Yes, I agree.
Thanks, Jeff. Excellent point there. And, that whole area of distributional differences among the different schemes, I think is one that we need to take account of. That's what we'll do is we'll move to the next segment now and consider another option in the mix, which is the option of a job guarantee, which I guess speaks more to the issue of of having a full employment opportunity as opposed to simply making unemployment more manageable for people. So I earlier introduced Dr. Bill Cochrane, Bill from Waikato University, who is a specialist in labour market matters. And when you're ready, Bill, I'll hand over the floor to you. Bill will talk for around 15 minutes or so, then you'll have an opportunity to chat, offer comments or questions, and then we'll close up by actually looking at the whole big picture and finding a way forward. Thanks, Bill. Over to you.
Okay, you can see the slide okay?
Yep, all good.
It's all good. Okay. Right. What we're going to do is talk a bit about the jobs guarantee. That my sort of feelings about job guarantees come from my sort of experience in the 1980s of being on PEP schemes and various other job schemes that were going at the time, that I still rated as one of my best jobs ever was pulling trees out of a river, that generally sort of keeping myself out of trouble by actual gainful employment. But so the idea underpinning a jobs guarantee is pretty straightforward. The state funds or directly provides paid employment to all who want it. That the idea that it's a universal guarantee has to be taken seriously. That it's just not a matter of rounding up the able-bodied males of the population and driving them off to do some menial tasks. To me, it involves a genuine attempt to allow everybody to participate in meaningful employment. So, for instance, if you take solo parents who wish to be in the labour force, then the state would be in the business of devising schemes where they might work from 9:30 in the morning until 2:30 in the afternoon. So you allow participation that based on people's objective circumstances. That participation would be voluntary. This is not slave labour. That I think that people would have incentives to participate because the unemployed, after all, usually want a job. That, and also labour has virtue in itself. Like people are interested in more than just the pecuniary benefits of labour, that they actually get a social reward for participating in labour. That the jobs guarantee's been associated strongly with modern monetary theory, but the actual idea of job guarantees and public creation of employment has gone on, or has been around far longer than the MMT proposals. Like if you look at some of the proposals by sort of reasonably orthodox Keynesians over the years for government job creation, that well before MMT came along, if you look at some of the actual practices, say during the New Deal, where there was widespread job creation in the US directly by the state, that, and of course, New Zealand itself's got a long history of provision of employment through the state. As I said, notably the Project Employment Program, that in the 1980s, there were a number of other related schemes that had a similar purpose of creating employment. That interestingly, things like the VOTP schemes, where they were more geared to providing more skilled labour to voluntary organisations. That I know that labour studies, when it existed at Waikato, actually funded some oral history projects through the VOTP scheme, things like that. We shouldn't shy away from the fact that poor program design led to a number of really negative experiences for people during the Great Depression. That my father was 60 when I was born, and so he actually at the time of the Great Depression was in charge of the relief work in the Hokianga in the far north. And he, while was an advocate of work schemes and things like that, had a number of very negative things to say about forced participation in them, and the horrors of taking people from basically soft clerical backgrounds in Auckland and shipping them up to gum country to dig ditches and things like that, which were clearly inappropriate kind of uses of their labour. That, so in any job guarantee, there has to be a real emphasis on the fact that the work is going to be meaningful and useful from the perspective of the worker. And in a lot of these things, I think that central to the design of them is an emphasis on what the worker thinks from their perspective of the quality of the employment. It's not an external measure, but an internal measure for the worker. That job guarantees are not a form of welfare. They're paid employment. That the paid employment that the state has created, but workers are paid wages and are workers and will be treated in effect the same as other workers. They're not on a benefit. That this avoids some of the scarring effects of benefit receipt. It activates the worker and that they actually have to be doing something, and it increases the autonomy of the worker. As I think it's overlooked that with a lot of welfare benefits and a lot of things where people are paid something other than a wage, that the sort of functionaries of the state have a habit of following people about, making comments on what they spend their money on. Like if you go down to the wholesale to buy a 6-pack to have a beer of a Friday night, you don't want to have WINS following you along that and telling you what to do. If you earn a wage, no one can tell you what to do with your money. And so I think that increases the autonomy of the worker. And it will have a positive effect on poverty reduction, that just simply because the kind of wages that would be being paid to job guarantee recipients would be that considerably in excess of what they might expect if they were just being paid on a benefit. But why would we implement a jobs guarantee? Well, I think that first it's a matter of principle. It's a basic social democratic principle that people have a right to work and to participate in meaningful work. That principle was lost in the 1980s, that it was certainly lost from how the unemployed were treated. That I think that as social democrats, we need to stand up for the principle of full employment, and we need to stand up for the principle that everybody is entitled to the right to participate in work. And I think that potentially, if the doom mongering around technological unemployment becomes a reality, that actually having a right to participate in work will become a major issue in and of itself. That I think that full employment at reasonable rates and under regular terms and conditions should be a primary goal of economic and social policy. That when the labour market's unable, it should be incumbent on the state to provide employment. That this means the state can ensure that close to full employment is maintained even in adverse economic conditions. So our aim is to run the economy at as near full employment as is possible. That jobs guarantee can deliver all kinds of positive benefits. That it helps unemployed workers retain job skills and avoid becoming detached from the labour market. While the best option is to hold people in work that or in their original jobs, that the next best option is to retain contact with the labour market so that people continue to get up and go to work in the morning, that they continue to be engaged in productive activity. That if you link it to training and education programs, then the jobs guarantee can help build the stock of human capital. That I think the process of running the jobs guarantee may well allow you to identify issues such as lack of literacy or lack of basic skills and do something about them, so you can actually use the jobs guarantee to build basic job readiness in people. That society as a whole benefits from the outputs from job guarantee schemes. Like, I still go out of a day and see people jogging about the pathways that were created by PEP workers in the 80s, that I see like a lot of improvement in the actual physical amenities of areas that were done by PEP workers. That I'm sure that there are many marae that were updated at the time, that maintained things like that, so that there is a general upgrading of amenity and social institutions by the operation of the jobs guarantee. And the jobs guarantee has quite a desirable self-regulating counter-cyclical stabilisation effect, where if times start getting tough and more people flow into unemployment, then you will see people picking up the jobs guarantee. When times get better, people will flow out of the jobs guarantee back into the regular labour market. The kind of proposal for job guarantee that I've seen that I quite liked for New Zealand was one where the central government would fund these schemes, but they'd be implemented at a local level by local authorities, iwi, and for various not-for-profits. Essentially, they'd punt up schemes, and those schemes would be vetted by the central government, then funded or not. While enactment could be, or be ideally be done at a countrywide level, that the guarantee could be implemented in a geographic area that was particularly prone to unemployment. You can imagine that somewhere like the far north has entrenched unemployment that has been very difficult to shift, that it would be perfectly feasible to implement a guaranteed employment scheme for those in far north, where that people who have been basically unemployed since the 1980s would be given employment, that, and they would then engage in improving the amenity of the far north. That you could also target specific groups, like that after a certain period of time on a social assistance program, then you gain an automatic entitlement to partake in the jobs guarantee program and then be able to continue in employment. Jobs guarantee wouldn't be time limited. That one of the things that I know from having worked on PEP schemes, that the single most urgent thing about it for the workers on those schemes was that they would be booted off after 6 months, regardless of their performance or anything else. Having an open-ended guarantee means that in areas like the far north, where there is incipient high unemployment, then the state would take charge of providing employment. That might have impacts on the mobility of workers, but I think that given the attributes of workers in the far north, that those that are immobile currently would not become more immobile just because of a jobs guarantee. But there's no point pushing people about the planet if they're just going to go somewhere else to be unemployed. That the terms and conditions offered by the jobs guarantee for employment would be at least equivalent to the minimum statutory requirements in employment and conform to best practice principles. That means that those on jobs guarantee work, that would be able to join unions, in fact, be actively encouraged to do so. That, and the administration of human resources would conform to best practices, not the lowest common denominator that is very common in low-wage employment. Some of the jobs guarantee employment would be at higher rates, that you can imagine that there is an amount of supervision required for labour, that, and intermediate levels of supervision as well, so that supervisors, lead hands, would be paid more. That also for some jobs guarantee schemes, for instance in the not-for-profit sector, then there are established rates for various types of caregiving and things like that. They would be expected to be paid at the prevailing rate in those areas. That the design of the jobs guarantee schemes would be aimed to ensure that private sector employment wasn't crowded out by jobs guarantees. That if proposals to implement a New Zealand-wide social insurance scheme were adopted, the jobs guarantee could operate as a backstop for those who lacked or had exhausted their employment entitlement or their insurance entitlement. How much would it cost? Well, Martin Taylor did a back of the envelope calculation and reckoned it would be around about 1% of GDP, that to hold unemployment to 1 to 2%. That one of my mates, who's an economist at Waikato, or sorry, at Massey now, came up with a very similar estimate, that the 1 to 2% unemployment was what we experienced from around the end of the Second World War to 1980. So I don't think it's unreasonable to expect unemployment to be held to that level, and that would, I think, be a fairer concept of employment than the 4% or so that people hold now. Of course, this is a ballpark figure, and a more accurate estimate will be forthcoming when we've thought a bit more about things. Okay, well, that's all I've got to say about that.
Thanks, Bill. That was an excellent summary of the job guarantee idea and indeed opportunity. And of course, as you rightly pointed out right up front, the principle is, if a principle we're committed to, and we need to be seriously committed to full employment, then that's a precondition of something like a job guarantee. We first need to be fully committed to the principle, I think, to do it properly and well. So we'll take a handful of questions before we go to the next and final segment, where we can kind of pull all this together. But for the moment, we'll take some questions and comments specifically on the job guarantee. And I see Jamie, you've had your hand up for a while. Was that a question on this particular topic? If so, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Bill, thank you for that presentation, and it's good to hear from someone who's had first-hand experience with these things. And I was just, I've been involved in this process for a while, and one thing I've been thinking of and been to raise is, what are your thoughts on work conditions for people in a job guarantee? Because my thinking is that this is an opportunity to really raise the level of good working conditions in New Zealand, because I worked in local government in Australia, and we had professional body representation, we had union representation, we had rostered days off as a matter of course, which most workers in Australia have. They only work a 4-day week or a 9-day fortnight. And, you have the unions are involved in the health and safety and involved in the pay negotiation and all of that. So do you think that is something that could be brought in through job guarantee to raise the level for all sectors, public, private, and voluntary sectors? and also job ownership. In Germany and the Netherlands, friends I know there, it's normal that workers have representation on boards, board of directors, and in the management teams. They call them the working group, and it's a system that's worked well since World War II at least. So what are your thoughts on that?
That I think the jobs guarantee provides a floor but my hope would be that the practices from the jobs guarantee scheme would become generalised throughout the whole economy, that low-waged employers would not just compete on wages but on conditions, because it would obviously be preferable to be working on a jobs guaranteed job with good conditions, union representation, and a say over what was going on, than it would be to be working in a private sector employment that didn't honour those conditions. So I think that there's kind of a leveraging effect where in the jobs market generally people would have an expectation of fair treatment. And I think that unions, of course, would be integral to the design of any jobs guarantee system, that they would very much be there to represent the interests of the workers in those schemes.
Thanks.
Yeah, because I recall in New Zealand, unfortunately, I entered the workforce until after, but before we had basically compulsory unionism, we had national awards for industries, we had things like travel allowances, clothing allowances. When I worked in Australia, I had clothing allowance, for dry cleaning. I worked in an office, so I could get my dry cleaning paid for by my employer. And, and for a lot of people, just traveling to work is a huge cost for them. And so I think that should all be included as part of the, the conditions of working.
Thanks, Jamie. Those are excellent points. There's a few people who've got their hands up, and I'll take Aileen. Eileen, you've been waiting a wee while.
Oh, thanks very much, Martin. Bill, I'm interested in the gender aspects of the job guarantee scheme and whether you've given any consideration to that. The PEP scheme was fairly located, as I recall, in kind of more heavy occupational kind of work, and to an extent the recent trades training announcements are more focused though not exclusively focused in areas where men predominate, male predominate. So I just wonder if you've given any thinking to that, and if you haven't, or what do you think we need to do to ensure there's a kind of a gender equity lens? That's my question. Thank you.
Right. Yes, we have given thought to that. But, my personal experience on the PEP schemes was there were about between 400 and 600 people where I was working that they operated, and this was manual labour, like cutting down trees, carrying on, things like that. Probably about a third of the people in that job were women. But they were engaged, like maybe not the heavy manual stuff, but on a whole lot of stuff. So I think that historically that there was certainly women employed in those schemes. I think that if you're to take a job guarantee seriously, you need to make sure that it's equitable for all parts of society, and that clearly gender equity will be a major consideration in the nature of employment that was undertaken. And I think that that just goes beyond saying that women can do the job as well, that it goes to saying, well, what can we do to make it easier for women to participate? So that would be things like flexible working hours so that people with children would be able to participate, that having schemes set up so that they fell within, say, the hours that a solo parent could work, that So tailoring the schemes to make inclusion like hardwired into them from the very start. And that's where I think there's that strong role for unions to make that kind of representation and have a strong role in ensuring an equitable job design.
Thanks. Thank you, Eileen. That was very raised. Barry, you're in the queue.
Okay, awesome. Hey, thanks so much, Bill. Really nice to hear your thoughts and thinking around this. And I think what stood out to me is the fact that you'd been through one of these processes and programs as a critical stakeholder yourself gave you a lot of deep understanding about what it would be like to be given the opportunity to go into one. Just things like participation is voluntary. The work has to be really sort of determining in terms of building self-worth and pride. And that goes back for me, from a psychological perspective, it always falls back on every individual has the right, it's not only to job, but to participate and to contribute and to feel like they belong in their community. And you can do that, which generally can come in a big way through the workplace. We're having a role, you increase your community social capital. And when you increase social capital, the knock-on effects of that are decreased mental health issues, increased general health, and increased well-being, decreased crime. So all these kind of things are around purpose and belonging. So I think it's fantastic. One of the things that I just wanted to kind of ask about, and I like the idea of this being a principle for New Zealand, and I think it's about post-COVID, perhaps New Zealand really defining its own kaupapa, what tikanga are important to it. And this is really in that whanaungatanga space, right? Everyone being able to have a sense of belonging to the New Zealand family. And what does that look like? So we know that some narratives post-COVID are things like kindness, but it also should be things like sense of purpose and being a part of that, like you said, tying it into things like you said with the running on footpaths that you know you're involved in. We see massive need for food resilience in our communities at the moment and food insecurity. Imagine if people had the opportunity to build local gardens and build local urban farms and really shift New Zealand's thinking and the outcomes for our people. Two questions I have, which you probably thought of. One is, you mentioned that if this is state funded on a national sense, but delivered locally, the programs are delivered locally, iwi could be involved in that, and not-for-profits. And I've done a lot of work with not-for-profits, and one thing they struggle with is, one, funding, of course, but two, even having a dedicated ear at the ministerial level as to who to speak to about their social cause and the funding that they need. And I often find it odd that these private groups that are out there trying to plug the gaps in Crown's responsibility don't have a dedicated minister or ministerial portfolio to go to Ministry of Not-for-Profit and talk to them about what they're doing. That's one.
Sorry, hey Barry, sorry, I know we're running short on time.
Okay, sorry, that's the only question. And then the last thing is, I'm just conscious of us always putting the responsibility of providing employment onto Crown when we have a look at AI and automation, the amount of displacement in the workplace that will come from that. And I think businesses need to have a better human circular economy going forward, not just a material circular economy. And that's it. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Barry. Those were good points. Now, what I'll do, there's quite a few people waiting, and I don't think we'll have enough time. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of people who haven't spoken yet. Well, in order, Sean, are you around?
Kia ora, how are you? If I post a link about leisure, I'm just wondering if I get a take from Bill, how you conceptualize leisure. You often hear it mentioned as free time, but to me it means so much more than that. The link I posted is from a German philosopher called Joseph Pieper, who wrote this book describing the work conditions of Germany post-World War II. And my question is about this expression, work-life balance. It seems to equate the two together, but to me, life has so much more value than work, and we overvalue the sphere of work. And I just want to get your viewpoint on whether we can find better expressions for work-life balance that rolls off the tongue so easily, but it seems to position them as if they have the same value when they don't. So can I get your viewpoint on, on that expression, work-life balance, and whether we can find alternatives to that?
I think the first point about work-life balance is that if you haven't got any coin in your pocket, any leisure time you have is going to not be particularly useful to you. So I see that the provision of an adequate income is fundamental to leisure. Like, I mean, people engage in leisure in all sorts of settings. Like there's that quite notable article by Darren Hodgetts and co. on the leisure time of homeless people. Like how do they spend their leisure time? So I think that leisure can come in diffuse ways, but to me, I want a world in which people have sufficient income to then spend their time that outside their jobs doing whatever it is they like. That I do not, I've no sort of enthusiasm for messing with what people do outside their jobs. I think that a lot of people are just happy going to work, coming home, being with their families. In terms of balance, I think, yeah, people need enough time that outside work to be able to have leisure if they have the resources to enjoy it.
But do you think that we value work?
Hey, Sean, I might just have to cut you off there because there's 3 more questions waiting and we'll make that the last on this job guarantee session. Jill or Lynn?
Yes, it's Jill. I just want to pick up on the point you first made, Bill, and the one Eileen was making, and that you talked about people who are from so-called soft clerical work being sent up to the Hokianga to do basically quite labour-intensive work. And I want to highlight the current government policy on retraining of displaced workers and the focus on shovel-ready jobs, when a large number of people who've been displaced by COVID are in fact workers like Air New Zealand crew who could realistically retrain in areas where we have massive shortages, such as teaching and midwifery, nursing and so on, but the government does not seem to want to put the money in like in the old days when we had studentships for teachers who were actually paid to attend university and then subsequently bonded to continue in that profession. And I think that we set our sights too low when we're thinking about the possibilities of retraining people.
Yeah, I agree. I think that appropriateness is a central feature of any job design. Like, there's no point in retraining your rocket scientists to dig holes in the ground. But you need, I mean, my view is that the bottom end of the labour market is where people are shuffled in and out of precarious jobs, and that you want to establish a floor for them. And then certainly, in addition to that, you have tailored schemes designed for particular people's needs. That, I mean, I think that one of the things that dealing with unemployment is showing is that while you have a mass problem, you deal with it as best you can, but then you engage in a series of targeted initiatives to mop up the rest.
Thanks, and thanks for that question, Jill. So Jane and then Gillian, and then we'll move to our final segment.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Bill. That was very good. I haven't got a question, I've got a comment, and it's simply this, that I like a lot of elements of the job guarantee, but the one I'd like to just highlight is the fact that I think when we're dealing with any kind of scheme that involves people, we really do need to think about psychological implications. And that's one of the things that I think you're doing with the job guarantee, because things like the impact upon people for long-term unemployment, and as you said, what you get out of having a job, these are factors that surely have to be put into the mix. It's not just a thing about money and statistics and so on. It's the psychological impact of having work. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. Points very well made. Gillian, you've got the last question in this segment.
Hello, Bill. I commend you for the work that you're doing. If you were in Hamilton in 1981, I might have been the PEP coordinator that employed you for the Hamilton City Council. I then went on to be a supervisor on a work scheme in Palmerston North, so I've had a little bit of experience. What I did notice as I moved on from that over the years, that the PEP schemes were branded Band-Aid, and that they weren't real jobs, and that they were competing with the market and real jobs. Hence, subsequent governments got rid of them. I think that perhaps that any new scheme would come under a similar threat and consequence of that happening. But no doubt you've been giving that thought as well, and bringing in a bit more value and quality to a scheme, a new scheme that might be introduced. But my comment, I guess, is really the government has a history, and we know is not that good at governing or managing business or this sort of thing. That yes, it would need to go to others, and that we would have to be really careful that it wouldn't be just throwing money away. Job creation, yes, the job creation I saw was meaningful in that it did get people out of bed, it did give people a purpose, it did get them into routine of work, and then it did give them hope. What I think we'd have to be careful of would be not to have work schemes that people started to feel like, well, I'm getting more money out of it and that's all I'm doing it for, or I'm just wasting time, and I'd rather be at home, with my feet up if only I had the same money. It's a really hard one. I also think the nanny state is something we have to be really careful of. For me, I think I would rather see incentives and encouragement by the government for startup initiatives. And you might say that the business enterprise does that. It doesn't really. I'm talking sort of more low key sort of thing that somebody who hasn't got a job would say, oh, I could do with that money, and this is what I could do with it, and then that gets them started. But they'd need encouragement, and that would need some sort of an agency. So that's just where I'm sitting with it. I'm not sure that's any use to you, but yeah, that's all I've got to say. Thanks.
Thanks very much for those comments. Much appreciated, Gillian. Now, what we'll do, and Robert, I see you've got your hand up, but we'll be opening up very shortly to the floor. But before we do, what I wanted to do was just set the scene with our two speakers to try to work out what is actually the best way forward. We've I guess effectively have three options on the table for improving things. One is actually simply improving the status quo, which we all acknowledge is broken in terms of dealing with people when they are unemployed. Another is providing essentially most likely a market-based system for improving people's situation when they become unemployed through an insurance scheme, therefore receiving a higher amount of income for a period of time. And for most people, that will be the period of time when they are actually actively seeking another job and indeed get a job. That can be quite a major benefit. And actually, one of the things that occurred to me when one of the questioners was discussing this with Michael was it also seems like it would potentially give bargaining power, that perhaps a little bit more bargaining power that we know we've lost in the market, if people feel that there's you know, losing their job is not going to be the same as, you know, mortgage, you know, reneging on the mortgage and having the family turfed out of their home. So it could have some hidden benefits such as that. But we also, and the job guarantee, of course, is really an expression of a serious, meaningful commitment that there should never not be a job for someone who wants to work and is prepared to work and is able to work. So that one, you know, really, I guess, takes a different view, and it says the issue isn't how we make people feel and how comfortable and how we allow, what resources we give them to cope while they are unemployed, but we are actually going to actively eliminate or reduce unemployment to levels that are far more reasonable, perhaps, than the current idea of, you know, so-called natural levels of unemployment. So we, of course, are having this conversation because we're staring at this tsunami of job losses, and we've already seen a vast number of them. And, you know, just putting this in some perspective, you know, even at the level that is apparently the natural level of unemployment, somewhere around 4%, we are really shutting down a city like Dunedin, because that's essentially the number of people who would be, you know, on that unemployed benefit, and saying the best we can do as a country is, you know, lock them in their rooms, give them the minimum sustainable income, and leave them to it. Well, this doesn't seem to be economically efficient apart from socially responsible. And of course, if we put their families in place, then Bill, your city would be entirely populated by people who are dependent on that unemployment benefit in some way. So this is a serious issue as well. You know, should we have unemployment at all? So with this tsunami of job losses coming, we've got a short-term problem, how we deal with that. And we've got a long-term, we need to have an eye on the long-term consequences, because as we've seen, when we deal with it badly, the consequences can be very bad for a very long time. And indeed, we are still living with what is now a third generation, in many cases, of children growing up in households of long-term unemployed from the 80s and 90s. So how should we move forward? What is politically and possible, but also what should we do? Bill and Michael, I'd like to get your comments on this initially, and then let's throw it open to the floor.
Michael's.
You're on mute, Michael. Michael, you're on mute.
I was only going to unmute to suggest that Bill would like to go first.
Oh, okay, right.
Would you like me to go first?
No, I'm quite happy to. You can go first if you want.
Thanks, Bill. I did mention your city as a great place to put all those, you know, the natural level of unemployment. So you should have the right to defend.
Yes, Hamilton is a splendid place. We're noted for our many cultural amenities. No, but what I'd say is, what's practical, one, we can do something about the benefit system so that people, like up front, have money in their pocket and aren't going to be cast into poverty and destitution. That we have the mechanisms for delivery already in place, that we have really a matter of a desire to just change benefit levels. I mean, it's been demonstrated that's eminently possible, that given the speed with which the government was able to enact changes already. So I'd say, one, that implement some pretty basic changes to the benefit system, as Michael has suggested, that so that we keep people afloat in the meantime. Secondly, I'd greatly increase public job creation so that what I imagine will be a very long tail on unemployment, that people won't become detached from the labour market, that the people will be able to continue to participate, and that they will be able to do so in a way which is meaningful and be reasonably remunerated for it.
Thanks. Michael, what was your...
I think Bill and I are in almost complete agreement. Yes, it's not hard to raise benefit rates. It's straightforward, and it was done very rapidly with the $25 increase, and it would be easy to do again. That's not to say that once you get into the detail, it gets more complicated, but yes, it can still be done. I also agree totally that a jobs guarantee program is a very good idea. I would also say that it's obviously not for everybody. There are other people who are going to need the welfare protection. And also we're going to need other sorts of active labour market programs, such as the old Job Plus program, placements into private employment and so on, subsidised placements and so on. As far as the distinction between the short term and the long term, two things, I think. One, all credit to the government for its focus on trades training and putting money into training programs for the longer term. I think that's going to be really valuable and proved to. And the other one is what you were saying about the past experience. To some extent, how well we turn out in the long term, it depends very strongly on what we do in the short term. If we make a mess of it like we did in the late 80s, early 90s, it's going to have a very long, nasty impact for a very long time to come. So I think it's important that we act quickly.
Thanks, Michael. That's and Bill. So we've got a few minutes remaining, and we'll throw it open if you have a question or comment, and particularly on the and ideas on what we should be doing, what we should be recommending, what is the best way forward. Feel free to jump in. We'll take a few more questions and comments. Robert, you've got your hand up. The floor is yours.
I would make the point that if we're going to get large numbers of people who are going to be unemployed, we're not looking at just creating paths and manual jobs. We need to be much more creative in a whole variety of ways. And I think that it's really important that any job creation really be linked to training opportunities, training people in different sorts of skills. And so it's not, so that's really a point I really want to make. I'd also like to make the point that if you start to look at climate warming scenarios, then we need to relearn basic skills to be able to adapt to a very changing, different, hostile world. And so the skills need to be linked to recognising that it's not just a question of going back to business as usual.
Thanks, Robert. Much appreciated. Jan, you've got your hand up.
Oh, hi. Thank you for great presentations. Hey, my question is that the National Party have come up with a policy which is capped at $500 million. It's the policy to give $10,000 a year over the first year to people newly employed, and that would bring 50,000 people back, presumably, into the workforce. And I kind of looked at what underlay it, and it's pretty well thought through, and it has costings and FYIs and all that sort of thing. And I just thought I wondered what the speakers thought about that as a possible way forward, and what the drawbacks of such an initiative might be.
But as far as I'm concerned, that yeah, like private sector job creation, that has its merits. A lot of the time, though, that if you have private sector job creation, then the job lasts exactly as long as the subsidy does. But if I was going to create private sector employment, then I would be more concerned about raising levels of aggregate demand in the economy generally. Like, I simply don't trust business to genuinely create jobs when subsidies are involved. I have a very pessimistic view of them.
Thank you.
Thanks, and thanks for that question, Jan. I'm not sure where that tapping was coming from. I was trying to unmute someone, or mute someone, but I couldn't quite find that other than the host. Okay, Bill, you've got a question or comment.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Look, if I could just have a go at answering your original question to the panel. I mean, I don't think these are alternatives. There's a package there. Firstly, we need to make sure that the welfare system does prevent poverty and ensure people can live in a dignified way. We need to have good active labour market policy programs, as they say. In other words, support for people to find good jobs, to relocate if they need to think about their career prospects with some assistance if they need it. And of course, an important part of that is retraining if that's appropriate. And we need to think about this not only in the current environment, but in the longer term environment where the issues of globalization, automation, climate change mean that people's jobs are going to be threatened for a whole lot of different reasons, and we need to support people through that change. But what I'm very aware of is that what I want to just add into that mix is social insurance, and it wouldn't be market based, I think, as you put it, Martin. Perhaps is not what you meant, but I do think it has to be a universal state provided one. Market-based ones just don't work because they won't insure the people who most need it. People in insecure work and people on low incomes who just can't afford it. So it needs to be a universal state run one. But what I'm very conscious, and it needs to also have some, have a maximum to it and a minimum to make sure that it doesn't become so that it's reasonably progressive and it doesn't and it does protect people at the bottom. But what I'm very conscious of is that even if we boost the social welfare system, as Michael was suggesting, or as the WEAG report suggested, for many people that does not support them through a significant time if we do have long-term unemployment, as is threatened now, or if they want to spend time, for example, retraining. And if they don't have the money to take them through an extended period of unemployment, then they are forced to do what happens at the moment, which is that they have to take the first job that comes to them. And we know that leads to very significant loss of income over an extended period, up to 25% of income over several years, and ongoing problems finding jobs. That's the current system. Boosting welfare would be a good step, but it doesn't solve the problem for everybody, and it doesn't solve those longer term issues of jobs being lost or whole industries shrinking or disappearing in the future. So I think we need that full package rather than focus on any one of these.
Thanks, Bill. And again, yeah, I think they're all certainly great parts to all of those. Now, Michael, yeah.
Can I just say, I agree with you, Bill. My concern is that we haven't had the first two of those, and that we may end up, there is a risk that we end up with a focus in the current crisis circumstances of the introduction of a social insurance thing without first getting the adequacy proposals. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just quickly respond to that. I mean, I think we are at a juncture, one of these historical junctures when these things become politically possible, because there's lots of people who are now becoming unemployed who never thought that this would happen to them. And so there would be public support for these kinds of changes. And so unless we grab that opportunity of this time in history, it just may not come again. So we do need to be ambitious in what we're thinking about here. I agree we need to really push the adequacy of welfare benefits, but that doesn't mean we should limit ourselves to that. Otherwise, this moment may not come again for generations.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's something we should all keep in mind. This is indeed one of those rare opportunities to do something big as opposed to tinkering. Now, we're going to be very short of time. I'm going to close off the commenters at the group that are there at the moment. That's Jamie, Mike, Yazdi, and Steve. I'll take the comments in that order, and then we will be probably ready for a sandwich and a coffee. Jamie, would you like to?
Oh yeah, I was just going to pretty much say what Bill Rosenberg said. So I was just, you know, I understand what Michael and Bill are saying about you need to do the immediate things first, but I think this could also be an opportunity to move on to some more general and universal type social insurance type systems. You know, like expanding ACC was originally supposed to ultimately cover sickness. So I understand when it was first set up and the report that established it, and it, you know, could it be extended to include guaranteed housing and warm and dry housing and things like that, and paying and because that prevents health problems, you know, feedback, and also feedback into health and safety in the workplace to reduce accidents and sort of get a more circular system going. And so yeah, I think yeah, we need to fix the immediate problems, but I think we should also be trying to steer towards some long-term gains for society.
Thanks, much appreciated, Jamie. Mike, the floor is yours. Now, Mike, are you there?
I'll just unmute myself. The point I wanted to make is about the job guarantee. There's a lot of misconceptions about what the job is actually, what was covered in the scope of inside what happened in the 1980s. There were an awful lot of very creative jobs, and I worked in a small social service agency in Wellington, and we set up all sorts of very interesting creative jobs that have led on to quite significant careers in a whole range of fields. So it wasn't just about filling holes with shovels and that kind of thing that I think is the conception. And I don't believe that the jobs there were problems with the scheme itself. It was abolished, and I was in the room representing the Labour Party when Richard Prebble told Garth Lomax, who was the Vice President, Tony Timms, the General Secretary, and me, who was the Trade Union Liaison Officer, that they were going to be cancelled. So it was for purely and simply ideological reasons, and to replace that provision of a job by the government with what they called training, which shifted, of course, all the costs onto the individual without the certainty of the employment. And the last thing I'd want to say is that what happened to the people who worked in those jobs were, when you think of training, it's not just going to a course, it's what all the benefits you gain from being with other people, from sharing in a common enterprise, from making a contribution to society, and all those things that are absolutely invaluable but not valued in our wider society. I said that was the last comment, but I'll make one more, which is I think it's time we ditch the Nairu, because that again was an ideological construct brought in by the same bloke. And so we should not accept that there is a natural rate of unemployment. We should be seeing employment and jobs as a right, and the government should be helping meet that right.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I think that certainly is a difference between the two approaches from those two different eras that we were looking at. Yazdi, you've got a comment?
Yes, please. Well, one of the major problem is for the tourist industry regarding quarantining people after they come into our country and how they mingle during the stay and restricting contact with people. Now, I feel that this is a time when quarantine management for tourism is becoming a new type of industry that people can, it's a new field which will have to be developed, and within which tourism itself people can also participate, because they are the ones who will be also be able to revitalize themselves. So I am suggesting that if we can have this sort of creating a better sort of this new field being encouraged, for the tourism can be able to come back quicker, and all this thing will happen, and that will be given a new type of a sort of a job creation facility, which will be very useful. That's what I'm fun. There's a lot. I got a longer details on it, but I'll cannot talk later. Okay, I can discuss it with you on later on.
Thanks, Yossi. And actually, what you have done there, of course, is highlight the opportunity to use a scheme like this to actually help with the transitions, where, you know, from one industry to another, to maybe seed a bit of seed capital for a new you know, a new opportunity, a new industry, and helping them with that transition from industries that have taken a bit of a hit, a permanent one.
Yes, the tourism people should be sort of be involved in it, because they are the ones who are going to be able to, the better they do and the better they supervise, the better will be their future and better for the whole country as such.
I think that sums it up. Thanks, Yazdi. Steve, you've got a comment or a question? And you're lucky last.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. Yeah, I just couldn't resist. A number of people in the meantime have sort of said similar things, but I think it is, if there's going to be high levels of unemployment, A, we need to do something, but B, it's a golden opportunity to do something without those people being stigmatized, because it's going to be, you know, everybody's going to be in the same boat. There's going to be lots of people who've never been unemployed in their lives who are going to be in that situation. Just going back to, as other people have said, going back to before the Labour government of Douglas and Preble in the late 70s and early 80s, under the National Party, when unemployment was rising from 0 to 3%, and it was a major political concern, then these PEP, TEP schemes were brought in to deal to that problem, and they were politically acceptable. Just a couple of details. One of them was it's been touched. I worked on 2 or 3 occasions for the Auckland Regional Authority, and it was a member. We all had to join the local government officers union, and we all got paid the rate for the job. It might have been administrative clerk, grade 7, or whatever it was. And I can remember an impromptu stop work meeting with about 50 people in the room, giving the giving the managers a bit of a hard time because of some issue that had you know, agitated the workers' minds. So I do think that if we, I think it was Gary Moore that said a friend of his was doing some research into the schemes at the time, and I think we need to capture some of that stuff, because that's the platform on which we should, you know, we should go higher. We should set that as the absolute bog standard minimum and then build from that. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. And well, and a very fine final word that was. So it's now just before noon. So I'd like to first of all heartily thank our 2 speakers, and that's Dr. Michael Fletcher and Dr. Bill Cochrane, who I think gave us both great background on 2 of these potentially significant changes that could be made at this time and improvements, and also for everyone here for some great discussion, ideas and dialogue. I guess now it's time to, you know, for us to try and change the narrative, to develop these new ideas, to get them put into the mix, and most importantly, to get them done, because we can see that there are good things not being done currently that can be done. So with that in mind, thank you very much. I would suggest if anyone's interested, I've just been keeping a very rough eye on it, but some fantastic stuff going on in the chat. You can save, there's a file button on the bottom of the chat screen, bottom right of the chat screen. You're welcome to save a copy before you exit. And I'm going to declare this meeting closed at 11:59. I'll leave it open for about 1 or 2 minutes just so that you can save the chat or whatever, and then we'll leave. But thank you very much for your participation, everyone. Much appreciated, and we'll see you for the next one. And thanks to all.